This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On February 5th, 2015, the Office of the Provost at Emory University hosted a forum titled Writing and Placing Op-Eds. The panel members discussed the nuts and bolts of writing opinion pieces and editorials based on their own experiences and described how publishing op-eds advanced their scholarship and careers. The speakers were Nathan McCall, lecturer in African American Studies at Emory and a former reporter for the Washington Post, Lynne Huffer, Samuel Candler Dobbs, professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory, and Carol Anderson, associate professor of African American Studies at Emory. In this video, Professor Huffer describes how she translates complex and sometimes abstract academic work into op-eds that are concrete and relevant to everyday life.
My own academic work is very philosophically oriented. It's very conceptual. It tends to be fairly abstract, and it's anti-foundationalist. So this poses a lot of challenges for writing op-eds that are concrete and seem relevant to everyday life. It really was a challenge for me, but I actually enjoyed doing it a lot. And I think of myself as a writer, and one of the things I do as a writer is I try to cultivate different writerly voices. I have a creative nonfiction voice, I have my academic voice, and my op-ed voice is another voice that I'm trying to cultivate. And I think it's possible to do that, and you just have to be really clear about what the form is that you're engaging in and who your audience is. And that's something that I got a lot clearer about in doing this work. So during the 1 year that I was involved in the op-ed project, I published 5 op-eds, and I felt like it was fairly successful. The first thing I would say is just practice, practice, practice. It definitely got easier over time. The first experience writing the op-ed was quite overwhelming and somewhat torturous, and I learned very quickly that writing an op-ed is not about dumbing down. That is not what it is. If anything, I think you have to be smarter because you have to learn how to take complex ideas and translate them into a language that communicates to a range of people regardless of their orientation, their disciplinary background, the knowledge base from which they're coming. And I think that that's a real challenge, a real intellectual challenge. So, anybody who thinks that it's dumbing down, I think doesn't understand what you're doing when you write an op-ed. The other thing that I think sometimes academics miss is the importance of what you're writing being timely. If you're a medieval historian, you have to figure out how is it that what you do as a medieval historian is relevant to something that's going on today. So it needs to be a timely, provocative piece that will make people want to listen to what you have to say. So some of the things that we learned, just the basics in the op-ed project, questions to ask yourself even before you get to the point of making a pitch, but something that you need to get clear with yourself about. To ask yourself, why now? Why now? So what? Why me? Why am I the person to write this? What is the aha that I have to offer? So I have a point of view that is going to give readers that kick. What is that aha that I have to offer? Economy of words, Nate mentioned this also. Use the power of words. Less is more. Less is more. Most of the op-eds I wrote were 800 words. Less is more. They also gave us a formula that I'll just tell you really quickly, which is you need to have a lead or a hook. So that's some sort of contemporary event that you're going to use to pull the reader in. And I can give you a couple of examples in a minute. Next, you have to have a clear thesis. You need an argument. And then you need concrete evidence for your argument. And when I say evidence, I don't mean some philosophical justification. I mean like evidence, like statistics, concrete evidence, empirical evidence. Usually it's good to have a to be sure paragraph, the counter argument that somebody might make, which is going to reinforce your own point, and then some sort of hopefully memorable conclusion that they're not going to cut. But I would also say that in the end, it's not as simple as a formula. It's really about the particular vision that you bring to whatever topic it is that you want to be writing about. So again, I don't see this as being at odds with academic writing. I see it as cultivating a different voice and using different styles. For example, in one of the op-eds that I wrote that was published in Al Jazeera, it was a critique of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. And instead of writing it as like this, you're so horrible because you're excluding like working class women, blah, 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 instead of writing it like that as a polemical piece, I wrote it as a letter. And I started it as Dear Sheryl, trying to convince her of my view through that epistolary form. So that's just an example of how you can play with different forms in op-eds in ways that I think can be really fun. So I just wanted to give you a couple, just really briefly, concrete examples of how I used my own work to write op-eds that appealed to a broad audience. My very first op-ed I published in September 2012, and it was on the topic of same-sex marriage. So you might remember that in May 2012, Obama was the first president to publicly support same-sex marriage. There's a very widely read gay and lesbian journal magazine called The Advocate. That summer they had a cover of The Advocate that had Obama sitting in the chair of the Lincoln Memorial instead of Lincoln. So there was a lot of irony for me in that picture, like the white liberator of enslaved people is replaced by the black liberator of same-sex couples. And so I wanted to write about that, and I have a critique of same-sex marriage as being the only focus of the gay and lesbian movement, and I wanted to write about that. And so I used Obama, the Democratic National Convention, which is at the end of that summer, to talk about what is our vision of social justice, what is our vision of love. And I started it by using Obama's words at the Democratic National Convention where he began by saying, "Michelle, I love you." And so that was an example of how I used the Democratic National Convention to then hook in to this argument that I was making about social justice and about love. The last op-ed that I wrote was in July 2013, and I came back to the issue of same-sex marriage. You might recall that in the summer of 2013, in United States v. Windsor, the Supreme Court overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, but that very same time, they also gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so I used that conjunction again, to write about my own vision of social justice, which isn't just about a single issue, it's about lots of issues. It's an anti-racist struggle, it's a struggle for sexual freedom, and how to think about those things together. And I actually used a personal narrative in order to talk about that, and I talked about going to a rally celebrating the overturning of DOMA in Midtown in Atlanta, and standing there with my partner, we're an interracial couple, and talking about our fraught feelings at that rally, because here we were celebrating something, but there was also this horrible gutting of this act that has catastrophic consequences. Actually, Carol talks about some of those in her op-ed about white rage, about voter ID laws and things like that. So those are just two examples of how I used my own work, my own thinking in sexuality studies and queer theory to talk about these issues that are more relevant for day-to-day life. I have other examples that I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. I wrote about reproductive rights for the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. I also wrote about Twinkies being sold, and that was a more sort of, playful piece. And both of those I think are interesting stories about timing. The Roe v. Wade one I could think about ahead of time because I knew the anniversary was coming up in January of 2013, the 40-year anniversary. The Twinkies piece was quicker. I was working on it, I was ready to send it off, and then the Sandy Hook massacre happened. I cannot send in a Twinkies piece in the face of that. I put it in my drawer. A few months later, somebody bought Twinkies, and I changed my hook and sent it out. So that's an example, too, of how you have to sometimes be flexible with the timing. Things happen that can't be predicted. And so all of that, I think, is worth thinking about in relation to your own work. So my closing points are just that I think it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be the center of your research. I'm not an expert on reproductive rights. I'm not like my colleague Michael Perry. I'm not an expert on constitutional law. Even though I kind of looked at the Constitution a little bit, I could still write an op-ed about it, about reproductive rights. And so I think, for me, my sort of question that I ask myself is, could I teach this material to a group of undergraduates? And if my answer to that is yes, I feel like I can write an op-ed about it. And then the second thing is, have fun with it and find support. I think having support is really crucial. The one sad note is just that since I stopped doing the op-ed project, I haven't written an op-ed. So I think that says a lot about that need that we have for mutual support, for bouncing ideas off of each other, and also just for reminding each other why it's important that we do this. So I really encourage you to form groups that will give you support, and I want to end by just sharing the thing that I always try to remember. We had to write a little placard at the end of the op-ed project to say in one sentence why we think it's important to do this, to have a public voice, and mine was, because I'm part of something bigger than I am. And I keep this on my wall to remind myself why I do this. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.